Finding a more exemplary company commander would have proven nearly impossible. This man had earned the Silver Star by leading a bayonet charge up a treacherous hillside on Guam, and the Bronze Star for repelling an enemy assault during a torrential rainstorm on Bougainville. With reverent care, he draped the captain's lifeless form with a poncho and bellowed for Dominic Grossi, a first lieutenant commanding a platoon that had begun the dawn with 40 stalwart men, but now counted merely 12 survivors. "Let us advance, Dom!" he roared above the thunderous din of battle. Grossi straightened his shoulders and echoed the command. "You heard the man! Move out! Move! Move!" Archambault seized a submachine gun and a canvas satchel heavy with grenades, then launched himself across the deadly runway. Grossi and his dozen remaining warriors followed 5 heartbeats behind, darting and zigzagging, ducking low as they sprinted toward the base of that enemy-infested cliff that loomed before them like a monument to death itself. Merely 5 yards beyond the shell-scarred runway intersection, a deadly beehive of concrete pillboxes erupted with machine gun fire that cut through the air like invisible scythes. Connecting these fortified positions were waist-deep trenches that swarmed with Japanese soldiers whose piercing battle cries were completely lost in the metallic clatter of their weapons. Marines vaulted over the sandbagged pits with desperate courage, hurling hand grenades in their wild charge, scrambling frantically for any foothold on that 50-foot hill that rose before them like a granite wall of death. They had clawed halfway up those jagged rocks when Marine artillery began falling like thunder from heaven. Colonel Duplantis had delivered on his promise of howitzer support. By then, 200 Marines, inspired by the bold dash of Archambault and Grossi and their men, had crossed the strip and pressed themselves against the steep slopes as shells slammed into Japanese positions above and behind them with earth-shaking force. Then disaster struck. The barrage began landing among the Marines themselves. The errant friendly fire was hastily called off before the company suffered serious losses from their own guns. After the confusion cleared like smoke in the wind, it took half an hour for the troops to form a scrimmage line and begin clawing toward the crest of the ridge once more. Units of 1 platoon reached the summit only to be met with torrents of rifle and machine gun bullets, streaming from 3 directions, a system of trenches directly ahead, and camouflaged pillboxes positioned on their right and left flanks like the arms of a deadly embrace. A cascade of mortars whomped into the men still struggling among the coarse, cutting rocks on the slope below. In 15 devastating minutes, the Marine attack was beaten back completely. The men were pulled from the hill to regroup among the Japanese dead in the demolished trenches at the rubble-strewn base. Archambault grabbed his walkie-talkie and contacted Duplantis. "We will provide more artillery for you in 5 minutes, and it will continue for the next 15. The colonel informed the lieutenant with grim determination. "Then go after them again." Archambault's response crackled through the static. "Will do, Colonel, but tell the artillery to hit the Japanese and not us." The word spread through the company, now reduced to fewer than 100 men. They checked their weapons and ammunition with methodical precision and waited for the artillery to commence its deadly work. When the thunderous barrage finally stopped, Archambault and Grossi were the first to lunge forward into the maelstrom. There was nothing half-hearted about this attack. It was a desperate surge born of pure determination. But the men were utterly exhausted and still reeling from the previous firefight, their ranks slashed by more than half in less than an hour of hellish combat. They had advanced 25 feet up the hill in their desperate surge when the Japanese counterattacked with greater force and ferocity than ever before. From positions higher up that tortuous incline, the enemy swept the faltering line with rifle and automatic weapons fire, with machine guns and grenades raining death from above. It was a classic enactment of a battlefield scene as ancient as war itself. Too many determined and well-entrenched defenders beating off too few highly vulnerable attackers. The charge failed once again. Archambault again pulled his surviving men off the hill and, this time, back across the runway to safety. The clock showed noon. Since 9:15 that morning when they had jumped off, the Marines had advanced 800 yards up the pool table that was Motoyama No. 2. They had been atop the ridge that commanded the intersection of its runways, but twice they had been beaten back by those determined defenders whose positions still controlled the vital airstrip. In the next 90 minutes, the awesome power of the American fighting machine, stifled since D-Day by Kuribayashi's brilliant battle plan, his do-or-die troops, Iwo's enemy-friendly terrain, and the strategic demands of winning the war in the Pacific would finally show its invincibility. Archambault's men consolidated their thin line with grim efficiency. Troops regrouped and gathered more ammunition from fallen comrades. The wounded were carefully loaded onto stretchers and evacuated to aid stations. Ships offshore pummeled the obstreperous ridge with their massive guns. Carrier-based planes swarmed in like angry hornets with ground-level bombing and strafing runs that shook the earth. Marine artillery hammered the slopes and the ridge with relentless precision. The runway had become a tableau of utter devastation, a moonscape of craters and debris. Raoul Archambault raised his voice once more above the chaos. "Let us go, Marines." The men launched themselves in a screaming charge across that deadly runway, their battle cries echoing off the cliffs. Then, with feet digging sideways for traction, the troops hit the slope like a human avalanche. Some men crawled as they moved from one shell hole to the next, from boulder to boulder, still yelling like Indians on the warpath, and firing their weapons like cowboys on a drunken spree. In less than 2 minutes they had scaled the hill and plunged over the crest against surprisingly light opposition. Then, like demons emerging from the earth itself, a swarm of Japanese soldiers roared forward with fixed bayonets gleaming in the afternoon sun. They had waited to hit the Marines at the crucial instant, and now they poured from a hidden gully on the reverse side of the ridge like water through a broken dam. What followed was a desperate man-against-man struggle for survival that defied description. Victory or defeat on the hill was not what mattered to friend or foe. It was an explosion of the primitive instinct to eliminate others to keep from being eliminated themselves. Japanese officers swung ceremonial swords with deadly precision and were impaled on Marine bayonets. Japanese troops lunged at Marines with bayoneted rifles and were clubbed to death with weapon butts, entrenching picks, even rocks torn from the volcanic soil. Hand grenades played no favorites in their deadly game, and their blasts injured and killed attackers and defenders alike without discrimination. Machine guns and rifles and pistols barked their deadly songs, and all around, men fell screaming in agony as they crumpled to the blood-soaked ground. The savage melee was over in 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. Archambault and his men had seized the ridge in action more violent and deadly than Chandler Johnson's troops had encountered on the slopes and summit of Suribachi. In taking this dangerous hill, the capture of Motoyama No. 2 had been sealed with blood and sacrifice. But more importantly, Kuribayashi's main defense line in Iwo's center had been shattered like glass. The Marines now had their desperately needed battlefield miracle, though like any miracle, no one knew exactly how this one had come about. Tactics were no different from those used since D-Day. Marines slamming against fanatic Japanese using tortuous terrain and fighting with deadly skill to answer each thrust. Perhaps it was the sheer impetus born of desperation. Frank Huff, himself a Marine captain who had witnessed other battles, later speculated with the wisdom of experience, but for whatever reasons, the fire that had been checking the whole attack failed to stop this particular outfit. Colonel Duplantis called it the most aggressive and inspiring spectacle I ever witnessed in his long military career. K Company had followed Item's surge across the runway and joined Archambault's thin line of survivors to mop up the summit and dig in for an expected counterattack in force. "Hold at any cost!" came the order from a proud and hopeful Colonel Withers, who was seldom satisfied and was now urging the rest of his 21st Regiment to exploit this long-sought breakthrough. The ridge might belong to the Americans now, but the furious Japanese attempt to hold the airstrip and eliminate Marines continued to rage with undiminished ferocity. Under heavy artillery and mortar barrages that shook the earth, nearly 2,000 Marines and 20 tanks were hurled into the expanding push forward. This time there were few landmines, so the armor was able to support the attack with its firepower and cannon and machine guns roaring defiance. But it remained rough going for the infantry, who did not have 3 inches of steel armor, as did tank crews, to protect them from enemy shellfire, machine guns, small arms, snipers, and grenades that fell like deadly rain. Many units were dangerously low on ammunition, their supplies nearly exhausted by the furious fighting. Aid stations were backed up with casualties waiting for jeep ambulances to carry them to the rear through the ongoing maelstrom. With still 4 more hours of daylight remaining, and despite the sweep up the airstrip and the conquest of the ridge, there was a gnawing prospect that the Marines might not be able to hold the ground already seized with such sacrifice. Unless troops could receive ammunition bullets for rifles and machine guns, shells for the tanks and mortars, The outlook of being pushed back by a heavy counterattack was a serious and immediate concern. Desperate calls went out along the beaches, 2 miles behind the blazing action, for volunteers to carry supplies to the front lines through the hell of ongoing combat. Seabees cranked up their bulldozers and pulled loaded trailers up the terraces, across the first airstrip, and to within 200 yards of the fighting line where death waited around every corner. What became a 3,000-yard human conveyor belt, with hundreds of men packing crates and backpacks, pushing carts loaded with ammunition and water, went to work to refuel the attack with mechanical determination. William J. Middlebrooks, a 22-year-old corporal from Marianna, Florida, was among these brave volunteers. He had been in the thick of the fighting all day, every hour bringing fresh horrors. On Guam, he had served as a rifleman with the 21st Regiment. Now he worked as a combat correspondent, but his loyalties and instincts still lay more with his old outfit, Item Company, than in finding copy for newspapers back home. So he was carrying ammunition to his buddies, making trip after dangerous trip across that exposed runway. On his third journey across the airstrip, a sniper's bullet found its mark, delivering a fatal blow to this young man who had survived so much. He died minutes later in the arms of a corpsman in an aid station housed in a bombed-out culvert, his life ebbing away like water through sand. "We could not do nothing for him," said the medic, a buddy from the days on Guam, as tears washed down his grimy face, leaving clean tracks through the dirt and smoke stains. Resupply continued even after darkness fell, even after the immediate emergency had passed, and the 21st could look back on the shell-pocked runways now behind them. Hours after sunset, Marines were flabbergasted to see 2 flashlight beams swinging back and forth to point the way for a clanking bulldozer pulling a trailer across the runway in the darkness. "In a lot of ways, you gotta be crazy to be in the Marine Corps," a bemused old sergeant of 24 observed with gallows humor. "But those guys are stupid to boot." He thought differently as he helped unload the precious cargo of bullets and mortar shells and steel containers of hot food and coffee that tasted like salvation itself. On the 21st Regiment's right flank, the 4th Division's 24th Marines waged a day-long struggle against Charlie Dog Ridge, the elevation that had claimed Jumping Joe Chambers in its hungry maw. It stood 500 yards east of Archambault's Hill, a formidable escarpment where the Japanese had constructed nearly 100 concrete bunkers and pillboxes with methodical precision. The fighting matched the fury of seizing Motoyama No. 2 in its savage intensity. Within minutes after the jump-off, hopes for taking Charlie Dog by noon had vanished like smoke in the wind. It was again a battle for survival, a struggle to hold ground already gained in 3 days of costly combat that had consumed men like a hungry fire. From point-blank range, the Japanese unleashed streams of rifle and machine gun fire that cut through the air like invisible swords. Mortars and artillery fell every few seconds with clockwork regularity. Landmines stymied any movement of tanks, turning the armoured vehicles into sitting ducks. Anti-aircraft guns fired shells, timed to explode with deadly airbursts that filled the sky with shrapnel. So many Marines became casualties that 80 white phosphorus smoke shells were laid down to screen litter-bearers scrambling to retrieve the wounded from the killing fields. Stretchers were in such short supply that ponchos were often the only way to get fallen men from the battlefield, carried by their comrades like precious cargo. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander A. Vandergrift, Jr., commanding officer of the 24th Regiment's 3rd Battalion, still harboured hopes that Charlie Dog might fall by sundown. About 2:30 in the afternoon, he left his command post, some 50 yards behind the point, to assess the possibility of a final effort to take the hill that had cost them so dearly. He scampered forward, admonishing troops as he ran past foxholes in a low crouch. "Better keep down until things get better," he yelled above the din. "Watch out for mortars and snipers or they will get you." It was a needless warning. The battalion had lost nearly 100 men since jump-off, and those still able to fight were using every bit of cover they could find. Vandergrift made it to a front-line observation post and plunked down among 6 Marines huddled in the crater of a shell hole. He raised up to see if he could find a new route up the ridge when a bracket of mortars landed 20 feet away with earth-shaking force. He was hit in both legs by searing shrapnel and grievously wounded, but he was lucky compared to others. 4 men on the lip of the hole were dead, their lives snuffed out in an instant, and another lost both legs to the blast. Vandergrift's combat expertise and leadership would be sorely missed, but the loss of battalion commanders was rapidly becoming an ominous statistic in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Back in Washington, when headquarters received the word, at least one person took the news as more than a mere statistic. The latest of 8 battalion commanding officers to fall so far was the 39-year-old son of the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself. Correspondents Lardner and Sherrod had spent several hours with Vandergrift's outfit before he was wounded, observing the battle with the keen eyes of professional journalists. They were heading for the beach to write copy and send it to the El Dorado to be radioed to the mainland when fate intervened. Sherrod was about 10 feet in front of Lardner when, as he later recalled, we heard the old familiar whine of Japanese sniper bullets, one whine per 15 steps. There was nothing to do but keep walking and hope we did not get hit. He heard a thud that sounded as though an ox had been hit on the head with an axe. Lardner slumped to the ground and crawled a few feet into a shell hole for protection. There, grimacing with stabbing pain from his groin, the lanky, bespectacled, soft-spoken ex-sportswriter searched for the wound with trembling hands. That felt like no bullet, he told Sherrod with bewilderment. It felt like a rock. Which it was a ricochet from the sniper's bullet that had struck volcanic rock, and the correspondent was not seriously hurt, though shaken by the close call. That is what I get for writing the Japanese are fools for a fast curve, he lamented in describing the episode with characteristic humor. Months later, while showering in his New York apartment, a small chunk of Iwo's volcanic rock would plunk into the bathtub, a grim reminder of that distant battlefield. Lardner told friends that his wife, expressing marital concern, remarked with real surprise, "And to think that for all this time I could have been shot by a stray Japanese bullet." General Schmidt was on the field phone to Gates and Rocky at 4:30 in the afternoon, instructing them to cease operations as soon as conditions permitted. The situation map and casualty reports told the story of the day's fighting in stark, brutal numbers that spoke of heroism and sacrifice. In the face of the most bitter resistance yet encountered during the campaign, the men of the 5th Amphibious Corps had smashed ahead for the biggest gains of the battle so far. The 24th Regiment, on the right flank of the line, was 500 yards ahead of the morning's jump-off point, and Archie Vandergrift's battalion had seized Charlie Dog in an inspired, all-out charge after their commander was hit. In the centre, the troops of the 21st had swarmed 800 yards up the runways of Motoyama No. 2, and Archambault's men had been reinforced and were in strength atop their hard-won ridge. The 26th, west of the airstrip, had battled across 500 yards of gullies and ravines infested with pillboxes and bunkers like a maze of death. D-Day +5 had been another day of dangerous work for the Marines, dangerous work in the rock-strewn crevices, on the formidable ridges, and on the runways of the airstrip where every step could be a man's last. It had been a grinding day of battle for the tanks and artillery, but even more frantic for the infantry, with their rifles and machine guns and hand grenades, with their flamethrowers and demolitions charges, with their fixed bayonets and razor-sharp combat knives, with their entrenching tools and picks and rifle butts and fists and rocks, everything and anything that could be used in the grim business of ending human lives. But the troops had pulled off the hoped-for miracle through sheer determination and sacrifice. At sunset, after 6 days of unimaginable and unprecedented fighting, 7,000 Marines held a strong, in-depth line across the island. They had finally reached the D-Day objective that had seemed so impossibly distant. People back home bought newspaper extras by the thousands for the latest reports about the savage battle for an ugly island they had not known existed a week before. Millions turned radio dials to catch live broadcasts from the beachheads. At times, the sharp sounds of gunfire could be heard over the crackle of static, bringing the war directly into American living rooms. Eyewitness copy described the vicious shambles of the wreckage-strewn beachhead, told of the frantic fight for Mount Suribachi, of the carnage from the push for the high ground and the airstrips. A surging wave of pride, unity, and determination to win the war against Japan swept the nation in the wake of Joe Rosenthal's flag-raising photograph that would become an iconic symbol of American determination. But the surge of patriotism was tempered by the flood tide of casualties that poured in like a dark river. During the first 3 days of the invasion, no specific figures were released about losses. No estimate of casualties is yet available. Admiral Nimitz's D-Day communique had stated with military brevity, but news stories made it crystal clear that they were worse than Tarawa, worse than D-Day in Europe, worse than the battles Marines had fought in World War I. And on February 21st, the nation was shocked and appalled by an official announcement from Nimitz that hit like a thunderbolt. At 18 hours, our casualties on Iwo Jima were estimated at 644 dead, 4,108 wounded, and 560 missing. The grim, headline-producing announcement declared, "It sent a shockwave of fear across the country like nothing before." Under firm orders from the White House, no further mention of American losses was made in subsequent communiques. In the first place, it was a major error to let the enemy know the price the Marines were paying for Iwo, and the Japanese monitored every broadcast statement with careful attention. It also added fuel to the anti-Nimitz, anti-Smith tirades in the Hearst-Patterson-McCormick press, and among their coterie of supporters in Congress who sought political advantage. But Howlin' Mad Smith and the monks of Makalapa knew the true figures, or at least a close approximation of them. At the end of the 6th day of the invasion, more than 9,000 men had been killed or wounded or were missing in action, a staggering toll that spoke to the savage nature of this particular battle. Nearly 4 decades after the battle was over, the surgeons of Iwo Jima still marveled at what they had been able to accomplish in those hellish conditions. It was not that they were boastful of superior medical skills or basking in an illusion that other doctors could not have done the job with equal skill. It was simply a sober recognition of the fact that they had done it, that in the 36 days of monumental mayhem they had performed miracles not once or twice, but hundreds of times under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Surgeons and corpsmen had gone ashore with the first attack waves, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. Until the last shot was fired, there would be work for them to do, saving lives under fire. And wherever the pharmacists' mates were working their medical magic, a surgeon was alongside or not far away, ready to perform whatever surgical miracles were needed. Each battalion had a surgeon, 13 corpsmen, and 20 stretcher-bearers assigned to their medical team. Their base of operations was an aid station, and to save lives it had to be close to the front. The closer, the better, but never more than 200 or 300 yards from the action where men were falling by the dozens. For the first 3 days on Iwo, the distance was measured in feet rather than yards, so close were they to the fighting. What happened to Lieutenant Charles J. Heli was typical of medical teams caught in the beachhead inferno that consumed everything in its path. The 27-year-old doctor from Westfield, New Jersey, landed shortly after 9:30 on D-Day, in the deep black sand of Green Beach that clung to everything like volcanic powder. Moments later, he and his medics were treating the first casualties, men hit by small arms fire and scattered mortar bursts that announced the beginning of the slaughter. Half an hour later, their aid station was functioning in an open shell hole some 200 yards up the terraces toward the quarry, when General Kuribayashi sprang his carefully planned ambush with deadly efficiency. "It was 3 days before we moved," the young Irishman recalled years later. "There was no place to go. We could not move, and anyway we were right on the front, where men were getting hit every minute of every hour." When a Marine was wounded seriously, his first and best hope for survival was that a corpsman be nearby when the bullet or shrapnel found him. It meant life or death, in the first crucial minutes after a man was hit, that something be done to control hemorrhaging, to start the flow of life-saving plasma, to douse the wound with sulfur powder, to inject morphine to dull the screaming pain, and to get him to an aid station as quickly as humanly possible. First aid on the front was something like being caught up on a factory assembly line gone completely amok. A corpsman would get to a wounded Marine as quickly as he could, often crawling through enemy fire, and do what he could with the supplies at hand. Then stretcher-bearers would try to move forward, usually with sniper fire cracking around them and often under mortar and artillery shelling, to carry him to the aid station. The aid station was usually a tarpaulin-covered shell crater or burned-out bunker, sometimes a sandbagged culvert or revetment, anything that provided a modicum of protection from the constant enemy fire. Even after a wounded man reached an aid station, it was just the start of a continuing ordeal until he was evacuated and aboard a hospital ship where proper medical care could be provided. He was still within yards of the front, where aid stations were favorite targets for enemy shellfire and snipers, who seemed to take special pleasure in targeting medical personnel. And at best, a battalion surgeon could only make a quick diagnosis of the wound and, in life or death cases, perform simple patchwork surgery with whatever supplies were available. After the wounded Marine's fatigue jacket was tagged to show preliminary diagnosis and treatment, He was ready for someone to take him the next step on his journey to survival. After the first week, when the fighting had moved beyond Motoyama No. 2, it was a jeep ambulance driver whose vehicle could carry as many as 4 casualties to a division hospital. During the early fighting, however, it was a painful, slow, and dangerous trek by litter to the beaches, and often an agonizing wait for hours before a landing craft could make it through the devastation to ferry wounded to hospital ships anchored offshore. More often than not, jeep ambulances drew sniper and mortar fire as they shuttled to and from the front, and casualties were heavy among the drivers who risked their lives daily. A Marine combat correspondent wrote about the curious but understandable reaction of one of these battlefield chauffeurs to the constant Japanese harassment. 18-year-old Private First Class Gerald Grugan of Minneapolis, Minnesota, embodied the spirit of these brave drivers. Bleary-eyed, dirty, and with a faint trace of beard, he stopped his vehicle near an artillery emplacement. The operation was nearing the middle of the 3rd week, and the driver looked as if he had been in action continually since D-Day. "Where is the trigger that shoots this cannon?" Grugan asked the artilleryman, who pointed to the lanyard with a knowing smile. "If it is okay with you fellows, I would like to pull it the next time you fire. Those Japanese have been shooting at me for 2 weeks now, and I would like to give them something in return." The gunner nodded his approval. The gun crew grinned with understanding, and Grugan grasped the lanyard with both hands in anticipation. When the word came to fire, he did so with a mighty pull that sent a shell screaming toward enemy positions. Having given the enemy something in return, he left without another word and drove off to continue his dangerous missions. If countless Marines survived because of the valor of corpsmen and the skills of combat surgeons, it could not have happened without the brawn, bravery, and sacrifice of stretcher-bearers who carried the wounded through hell itself. Each attack battalion, when it landed, had 20 men assigned as litter-bearers, most of whom were musicians with regimental and division bands when not in combat. Many of these stretcher-bearers became casualties themselves very early in the battle, cut down while trying to save their wounded comrades. As their ranks were decimated, and with the unending deluge of casualties to be recovered, new men untrained for stretcher duty were constantly thrown into the battlefield maelstrom. These replacement stretcher-bearers included cooks and bakers whose kitchens had been destroyed, motor transport men whose vehicles were twisted wrecks on the beaches, landing craft crewmen whose Amtraks and Higgins boats had been sunk or were half-submerged hulks in the surf, company clerks whose files and typewriters were useless in this environment of pure destruction, buglers without bugles, and frightened replacements fresh from the States who were experiencing battle for the first time. Captain Raymond Honry, the 3rd Division's public relations officer, told of what happened to one litter detail that exemplified the dangers these men faced. The 4-man team had picked up a corporal whose legs had been shattered on Archambault's Ridge and was carrying him across the runway when an artillery burst landed with devastating effect. The wounded man somehow dived off the stretcher and plunged into a shell hole, his survival instincts overriding his injuries. The blast caught the stretcher-bearers. 2 were killed instantly, and the others badly injured by the explosion. The corporal escaped without a new wound, and another team rescued him within minutes, continuing the endless cycle of rescue and sacrifice. Henri recalled another instance when a private first class, wounded in the thigh, was being carried away from the lines by a stretcher team. A sniper opened up from a concealed position, and a bullet grazed his chest, adding injury to injury. As the bearers rushed him off, the captain remembered with admiration. The Marine lifted himself up on his elbow and, in perfect anger, shook his fist toward the hidden sniper and yelled, "God damn you! Is not once enough?" Sergeant Francis W. Cockrell, a combat photographer with the 5th Division, made pictures of stretcher teams from the 28th Regiment under fire on D-Day that captured the heroism and horror of their mission. "I saw them carrying casualties down the hill to the beach, through small arms fire coming from both sides, through bursts of mortar shells," he later wrote with the precision of an eyewitness. "They could not run very fast, carrying a litter with a wounded man. They had to stay upright to maintain balance. They had to stop for rest in that sand, and when they did, there was rarely a handy hole to fit 4 men and a litter case, so they made a dandy target for enemy snipers and machine gunners. Even after casualties made it to a division hospital and were treated there and tagged for evacuation, they still faced a cruel ordeal that seemed to never end. For most of the campaign, there were no areas on Iwo where safety was more than a wish and a prayer. Beachhead evacuation points were still taking artillery and mortar barrages 2 weeks after D-Day, making even the rear areas dangerous. Some men were wounded a second time, and a few a third, while waiting for a ride to a hospital ship. Then there was the surf that added another layer of danger to the evacuation process. The restless sea rarely quieted down, and constantly shifting winds made the pounding waves unpredictable and sometimes impossible to navigate safely. Even when the surf was down, swells tossed evacuation craft with such force that strong men had to grasp handrails to stay on their feet during the turbulent half-hour run from shore to ship. The toughest stage of the evacuation came last, getting the wounded safely aboard ship from boats that bobbed like huge slabs of cork, rising and falling as much as 10 feet with each wave. It was a dangerous and delicate maneuver that demanded split-second timing, even when special cranes were used to hoist stretchers straight up the side of the ship. If a litter was hooked to the cable an instant too soon or too late, a sudden swell would smash it against the hull with potentially fatal results. Once on the hospital ship's deck, the odds for survival were firmly on the side of the wounded. Better than 95% would live and most would recover completely from their wounds. But there were others, some with missing limbs, some sightless, some without voices, some paralyzed, who would endure the mental and physical pain of shattered bodies for the rest of their lives. Admiral Nimitz and the monks of Makalapa had expected, when the invasion was planned in the distant safety of headquarters, that the 4th and 5th Division hospitals would be in operation by the afternoon of D-Day +2. But it was 5 days before the first one the 4ths would begin treating the wounded in anything resembling proper medical facilities. Commander Richard Silvis, the outfit's ruddy and raw-boned chief surgeon, had landed in an early wave on D-Day, ready to begin saving lives immediately. His 5th Division counterpart, Lieutenant Commander William W. Ayres, also was ashore before 10 o'clock, establishing medical operations under fire. Battalion and regimental surgeons hit the beaches with the troops, sharing their dangers and immediately becoming swamped with casualties that poured in like a human flood. Working in shell holes and bombed-out bunkers, they did everything humanly possible for the flood of early wounded, but conditions were far from ideal. It was impossible to operate properly in the chaos of the beachhead, and there were so many casualties that all the doctors could do was to try to stop bleeding, prevent infection, and control pain, and tag the wounded for evacuation while hoping they would make it to the operating rooms on the Samaritan or Solace, or to transports and LSTs with hospital facilities. By noon of D-Day, there was little doubt that at least some 3rd Division troops would be called in from the floating reserve, and Commander Anthony E. Raymond, the 3rd's chief surgeon, landed while the 21st Regiment was still aboard its transports offshore. "We need all the help we can get to save the lives of my Marines," General Smith had declared with characteristic bluntness. So Raymond was on the beachhead with most of his doctors, ready to join the medical battle that would rage for weeks. By mid-morning of D-Day +4, when a semblance of order had begun to emerge along the shoreline, the 4th Division's hospital took its first wounded through the tent flaps of a makeshift facility located in the revetment of a highly vulnerable site along the eastern edge of Motoyama No. 1. Bulldozers had carved an embankment in a cliff to provide some protection from shelling, but artillery and mortar fire still crashed into the area with disconcerting regularity. 2 long, dark green tents and 6 smaller ones formed the nerve center of this crude but vital complex. One of the big tents served as part receiving ward and part operating room for less critical cases. 8 operating tables, lighted by large, non-shadow electric lamps, were positioned at one end of the receiving tent, along with an X-ray machine and a refrigerator for drugs, plasma, and whole blood. Generators would often sputter and quit for periods of time, especially when shells exploded nearby, and emergency battery-powered lights would take over to continue the life-saving work. The other tent served as the recovery ward, with 80 cots where wounded were taken after surgery to await transfer to hospital ships, or later, when ambulance planes could land, to be airlifted to base hospitals on Saipan, Guam, and the Hawaiian Islands. 2 rain-catching cisterns were converted into operating rooms for the most serious cases, chest wounds, amputations, and brain and eye surgery. Their roofs were waterproofed canvas, salvaged from a truck mired on the beach, but the walls and floors were thick concrete that provided solid protection from shell fire, except for the always-present danger of a direct hit down the hatch. Until the island was finally conquered, The lights in the operating rooms were never extinguished, burning constantly as a beacon of hope for the wounded. In a far-fetched fashion, the scene would later become familiar to millions of Americans in the 1970s and 80s watching the M.A.S.H. television series. The show depicted dedicated and skilled doctors operating endless hours under impossible conditions. The sights and sounds of combat, the constant presence of danger and death. But the reality of Iwo Jima and the television version of an operating room had little in common beyond the basic concept. There were no attractive nurses bringing comfort to the wounded, no steady stream of comedic, if cynical, dialogue on Iwo to lighten the mood. And the M.A.S.H. facilities could only be described as safe, antiseptic, and well-equipped compared with Iwo's blood-stained cisterns and tents without floors that served as operating theatres. Receiving and recovery wards were eerie scenes filled with grimy, smelly, grievously hurt Marines who had not washed since landing, much less changed clothes. The air was always heavy with stale cigarette smoke, and reeked with the putrid odour of ether, ruptured intestines, and lost limbs that created an assault on the senses. It seemed remarkable that in the midst of so much pain and suffering there was so much calm, as the wounded waited with stoic resignation for whatever would come next. Many had reached a state of acceptance that transcended their physical agony. "Many men come in here with a sense of relief," observed Lieutenant Commander Howard Johnson, a surgeon from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. "The battle is over for them, and they figure they are lucky to get out alive." Lieutenant Commander Paul Giddings, from Augusta, Maine, who had operated under fire at Roy Namur and Saipan in previous campaigns, had never seen such wounds as they bring into the hospital here. The nature and severity of injuries from this particular battle exceeded anything in his considerable experience. Surgical teams, 3 doctors to a team, worked in each cistern around the clock. Chain-smoking Commander Reuben Sharp, from Camden, New Jersey, was an expert at treating stomach wounds, and despite the primitive conditions, was justifiably proud of the results his team achieved under such adverse circumstances. "The mortality rate in belly cases is generally 70%, he told a newsman with professional pride, "but we ought to save half of those we have operated on today." A month after the battle, only 11 of the 45 abdominal cases had died of their wounds, a remarkable achievement given the conditions. Many Marines lived because of transfusions of whole blood, now available for the first time in the Pacific War. This precious fluid was literally a gift of life from donors on the West Coast, flown 6,000 miles to the battle in special ice-packed containers that maintained its viability. "This whole blood is wonderful stuff," Dr. Silvis declared with enthusiasm. "Much better than plasma when there is severe hemorrhaging. The difference between life and death often came down to having this fresh blood available at the critical moment. In some instances, donors had added a personal touch to their gifts of life. They had scrawled their names on the pint bottles of precious fluid, creating a direct connection between the home front and the battlefield that was both touching and practical. While the fighting raged for the second airstrip, a jeep ambulance brought 7 cases of whole blood to an aid station on the front lines. "Break it out on the double," Lieutenant Commander Leo Thylan, a battalion surgeon, shouted to corpsmen, and minutes later, the scarlet fluid was flowing into the arms of Marines on stretchers in the sandbagged, canvas-covered shell crater that served as their medical facility. After the invasion began, this life-saving blood had been drawn in donor centers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and Portland. "Bless it," said Captain C.P. Archambault, a 3rd Division surgeon from Brooklyn, expressing the gratitude felt by all medical personnel for this miraculous supply of life itself. Whole blood also had a heartening cosmetic value that boosted morale among the wounded and their visitors. When Marines could take time from battle to visit wounded comrades, they had expected to find them looking like paraffin mummies, as they had appeared in earlier campaigns when only plasma was available. Instead, the visitors saw faces and lips with a more normal, healthy glow that spoke of recovery and hope. "You doctors sure know what you are doing," observed a husky 5th Division gunnery sergeant with obvious relief and admiration. "Oh, we just put makeup and lipstick on them," came the tongue-in-cheek explanation from the medical staff, using humor to deflect from the serious nature of their life-saving work. It was nearly 2 weeks before the 3rd and 5th Division hospitals were in full operation. But meanwhile, their teams of medics worked around the clock in sandbagged revetments near Motoyama No. 1 and in frontline aid stations, waiting for the fighting to move forward enough so there was space for their wards and operating tents. The need for their services was always immediate and pressing. On D-Day+15, the Navy established the first operation of its kind in the Pacific War, a beachhead evacuation station. It was positioned on Purple Beach, which had not been used in the attack landing on the western shore near the base of Suribachi. By nightfall, its 200 cots were filled with Marines who had undergone surgery in division hospitals and were recovering. Major Samuel S. Kirkland and 22 officers and 182 enlisted medics soon established the Army's 38th Field Hospital. They would remain as Iwo's permanent medical unit after the invasion force departed, but there was plenty for its 6 surgeons to accomplish before that time came. By the time the battle was finally over, they had operated on 592 Marines, 360 of whom required major surgery. Up on the lines, the Japanese were constantly ensuring that hospitals did not want for patients, maintaining a steady stream of casualties. But with skilled doctors ashore, and with more and more facilities to work with, the chances of survival for the wounded improved steadily as the battle progressed. Maybe, after all, the last Marines would not die knocking out the last Japanese gunner, as General Erskine had grimly predicted. Since primitive man first took up crude arms against one another, disposing of the dead has been an inevitable military fact of life. On Iwo Jima, it became an especially cruel and dangerous business that added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Japanese shelling was so heavy, the machine gun and small arms fire so intense everywhere on the slim beachhead, that Marines still alive and unhurt were fully occupied with trying to survive moment by moment. But unburied dead on Iwo, as on all battlegrounds throughout history, posed a serious health and morale problem that demanded immediate attention. Late in the afternoon of D-Day+1, the Graves registration officer of the 4th Division landed on Yellow Beach with the first working parties to begin the ugly assignment of burying the dead as soon as possible. Their 5th Division counterparts followed the next morning on Red Beach, beginning what would become a massive and heartbreaking operation. It was 200 yards inland from Red Beach where the coarse, black sandy terraces sloped up from the surf and across the narrow neck of the island and down the western shoreline that the battle planners at Makalapa had decided to locate the burial grounds on Iwo Jima. There ultimately would be 3 crowded cemeteries, the 5th Divisions, positioned closest to Suribachi, and the 3rd and 4th Divisions, located side by side on the incline leading up to the north-south runway of Motoyama No. 1. The sites were chosen with both practical and symbolic considerations in mind. The chosen areas were infested with landmines, some as large as garbage cans, and duds from Japanese artillery and American naval shelling and airstrikes. These explosive devices had to be defused or detonated before burials could begin, and the ticklish operations brought down heavy enemy cannon and mortar fire from observers who seemed to take special pleasure in targeting the gravediggers. Enemy fire continued to fall spasmodically, but with deadly results, among the gravediggers 2 weeks after D-Day, making their already difficult job even more dangerous and heartbreaking. By the time the push to take Motoyama No. 2 was at its climax, collecting the dead had become a methodical part of Iwo's daily routine, as regular and predictable as the sunrise. Service troops, unaccustomed to the ghoulish work but pressed into it by necessity, retrieved bodies and, in many tragic cases, parts of bodies from where the men had fallen. Sometimes the dead were found on the front lines, sometimes in no man's land, sometimes behind the lines where the fighting had already passed by like a deadly tide. Japanese snipers seemed to take a special delight in trying to kill Marines who were trying to recover bodies of Marines already dead, Francis Cockrell remembered with bitter accuracy. Bodies were collected, 4 to 6 at a time, on a twice-daily schedule by Graves registration teams, and transported to the cemeteries in whatever vehicles were available. Then began the slow, painstaking, sometimes futile process of establishing positive identification of the fallen heroes. Nothing was left to chance in this solemn duty, and the grim task was performed by experts with meticulous care. Dog tags, wallets, names stenciled on dungarees and rubber-stamped on shirts and underwear, ID bracelets, engraved watches, rifle numbers, all were checked and double-checked to ensure accurate identification. Fingerprints were taken and dental charts made whenever possible. Personal belongings, letters, photographs, Bibles, notebooks, rings, watches, anything found on the body were carefully tagged and boxed for the long voyage home to grieving families. Most of the handwritten letters were poignant chronicles of the latest news from friends and loved ones, filled with expressions of love and hope that would never be answered. Not so the typewritten ones, which sometimes provided grimly ironic counterpoints to the tragedy. In the breast pocket of one young private was found a no-nonsense communication from a loan company back home. "Unless we receive immediate payment," it read with bureaucratic coldness, "you can find yourself in serious trouble." The dead Marine's wife and 2 small children were living with her parents in California, struggling to make ends meet. 7 months earlier, the fallen man had been working at a Lockheed aircraft plant in Burbank, contributing to the war effort in his own way before being called to serve on the front lines. Now he lay dead on a volcanic island thousands of miles from home, his financial troubles permanently resolved. Interment was, of necessity, a mass and impersonal affair. There were simply too many bodies to handle individually with the care they deserved. Bulldozers cut trenches in the volcanic ash 8 feet deep and about 30 yards long that served as mass graves for America's heroes. Shrouds were green GI blankets or ponchos, humble coverings for men who had given everything for their country. Bodies were placed in the ground in accordance with strict Marine Corps regulations. 3 feet from center line of body to center line of body, 50 bodies to a row, 3 feet between rows. Each grave was meticulously listed on a master location chart with the dead man's name, rank, serial number, and unit. Pre-painted wooden crosses and slab-like markers, cut to specifications by a lumber contractor in the States, came bundled for efficient handling and were assembled on-site and stenciled with each dead man's name. In cases where positive identification was impossible despite all efforts, the graves were solemnly stenciled, "Unknown," a heartbreaking reminder of war's ultimate anonymity. For 146 Marines who were hit on the beaches on D-Day and died aboard transports after being evacuated, burial was at sea in water at least 100 fathoms deep, as directed by naval regulations. Later, when the beachhead was less chaotic, those who died aboard ships were taken back to the island for proper interment alongside their brothers in arms. 2 weeks after D-Day, with the front nearly 3 miles to the north from the beaches, Private First Class Gordon E. Diggs of Paris, Texas, was walking near the 4th Division Cemetery. He had come down from the lines to look for the grave of a buddy when tragedy struck without warning. He stepped on a landmine that had somehow escaped detection during the clearing operations. The explosion ripped off one of his feet at the ankle, badly mangled his other leg, and his hands and arms were badly torn and burned black by the blast. "Jesus Christ, Doctor, I must have gone 40 feet high when I stepped on the goddamned thing," he told the surgeon, who operated on him with characteristic Marine humor in the face of devastating injury. Even as the battle was reaching its peak in the highlands of the north, and while hundreds of Marines were being buried daily, the cemeteries already had the look of hallowed ground that would endure for generations. Winds carried the sound of heavy shelling back from the front, but each day the ashy, wind-blown soil was carefully raked between the rows of white crosses. CB carpenters used wood from empty mortar cases to build picket fences, which were painted white, around each burial ground. Stonemasons from their ranks laid entrance arches from Iwo's ample supply of volcanic boulders, creating dignified entrances to these sacred spaces. In time, gravekeepers managed to coax growths of scrub grass and small beds of flowers to bring splashes of color to the otherwise barren landscape, creating beauty in the midst of devastation. But months after battle's end, Army garrison troops continued to find landmines and unexploded shells in the area, deadly reminders of the battle's intensity. What to do with Japanese dead was a constant and troubling concern for the Americans. Left unburied, they too posed serious disease problems, and the stench and sight of their bloated bodies were repugnant even to hard-bitten Marine infantrymen who had seen more than their share of death. When enemy bodies were found in clusters, bulldozers heaped mounds of earth over them, but this seldom happened due to circumstances beyond American control. Part of General Kuribayashi's brilliant strategy was to conceal his losses from the Americans, denying them accurate intelligence about enemy strength. When they could manage it, the enemy sneaked out at night to recover bodies and hide them in caves, maintaining the fiction that Japanese forces remained at full strength. While there were no formal cemeteries for the Japanese on Iwo, Marines entombed thousands, whose bodies would decay underground in emplacements sealed by demolitions charges. Other thousands died of wounds in catacombs extending hundreds of yards into the sides of Iwo's countless cliffs and ridges, buried forever in the volcanic rock. Uncounted others committed suicide in a final act of Bushido, choosing death over the dishonor of capture. 23-year-old Charles M. Blodgett, a first lieutenant from Des Moines, Iowa, led a patrol of scouts and snipers into one cave among the craggy ledges of the 4th Division Zone on Iwo's eastern shore. Like dozens of other charnel houses discovered by Marines, it had served multiple purposes during the battle. The cave had been used as a fortification during the fighting, then as a makeshift hospital for wounded Japanese soldiers, and finally as a place to dispose of the dead when medical efforts failed. A captured Japanese medic led the way as the Marines warily started down one of the cave's 6 entrances. He was followed by Sergeant Howard B. Inman, a war dog handler from South Amboy, New Jersey, and his Doberman Pinscher that had first detected the installation with its keen senses. The rest of the patrol followed cautiously, all with weapons at the ready for whatever they might encounter in the darkness. Dave Dempsey, the Marine correspondent, was with them as they moved down the twisting, dungeon-like passageway that seemed to descend into the very bowels of the earth. Narrow, tunnel-like veins led off each side, and we approached them stealthily, he wrote of the eerie episode. The most amazing thing about this miniature city is that it was no natural cavern, but was made entirely by hand. Chisel marks on the walls testified to the infinite patience that had gone into the making of this bomb-proof haven. The entrances were flanked by 47mm guns, but the gunners had been killed by our shelling. As the Marines went deeper into the catacomb, they encountered scenes of death and destruction that defied description. Dead enemy troops lined the passage, their bodies telling the story of the cave's final days. Many bodies were partially cremated by explosions, others were bloated by decay, and the stench was overpowering even to men accustomed to the smell of death. Empty cases of medical supplies spoke silently of desperate attempts by Japanese medical personnel to save their wounded comrades. The Marines were some 60 feet underground and perhaps 100 yards from the cave's mouth when their prisoner made contact with one of his surviving comrades. He went ahead to talk with his people, Dempsey reported, and we waited tensely in the gloom. In a few minutes he returned to tell our interpreter that an officer and 11 men were still alive. They wanted 2 hours to talk among themselves about surrendering. At the end of that time, they would either commit mass suicide or come out. Lieutenant Blodgett, demonstrating the pragmatic leadership that characterized Marine officers, sent word back that they could have 1 hour for their deliberations, and the patrol eased cautiously toward the mouth of the cave, where Marines had been posted as guards and demolitions men were standing by with their charges. Dempsey described the tense scene that followed. It was a long, suspense-ridden 60 minutes. We waited expectantly, listening for the dull thud of hand grenades that would signal mass suicide, or hoping for the appearance of the Japanese soldiers ready to surrender. Finally they came. The officer had been shot in both legs and was carried on a stretcher by 4 of his men. 6 others, also wounded, hobbled behind in the strange procession. The officer sat upright on his stretcher and bowed with dignity. Resignation mingled with pride in his awkward gesture. He asked that he be allowed to keep his saber as a symbol of his honor. Our lieutenant granted permission. The demolitions men then sealed the entrance of this cave, along with 5 others in the immediate area, entombing forever more than 200 of Iwo's defenders in an unmarked grave, some 650 miles from the Japanese homeland. They would remain there as silent testimony to the battle's ferocity. 10 years later, in a gesture of respect and remembrance, the body of each Marine buried in the division cemeteries would be exhumed and returned to American soil for final burial. The Punch Bowl, Hawaii's national cemetery located in an extinct volcano where Ernie Pyle was buried, would become the final resting place for many of these heroes. Others would be consecrated in the National Shrine at Arlington, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., near where a remembering nation would later erect a giant bronze replica of Joe Rosenthal's iconic picture of the second flag raising on Suribachi. National cemeteries scattered across the country would hold the remains of other Iwo dead, while family plots in home cities and towns would be the last grave sites of many others. Where Iwo's fallen would finally rest was a decision made by next of kin who wanted their loved ones close to home. And now, over each grave, taps would be sounded with all the ceremony and respect these fallen heroes deserved. There had not been time for this sacred ritual on Iwo Jima itself, where survival took precedence over ceremony. Wherever Marines fought in the Pacific Theater, they went into battle knowing that the fortunes of war had to be on their side if they were to come through any invasion alive and unwounded. From the first frightening, confusing day in boot camp, the deadly nature and cost of the war of invading Japanese-held islands defended by fanatical troops ready to fight to the death were drilled into recruits every waking hour and carried into their troubled dreams. That was the fundamental purpose of boot camp, to mold the broadest mix of young Americans into skilled tradesmen in a kill-or-be-killed business, and to keep intact and untarnished the glory and traditions of the United States Marine Corps that stretched back to the nation's founding. Gene Jones remembered his rude awakening, his brusque post-midnight introduction to recruit training in early 1943, soon after he turned 18 and left his childhood behind forever. The moment I got off the train at Paris Island with a bunch of tough older Philadelphia dockworkers, a hard little corporal, who was about 19 and had earned a Purple Heart and 2 battle stars, looked us in the eye. The first thing he said was, "I promise that 60% of you will be casualties within the year, and most of you will be dead." It was a sobering introduction to the reality of war that no amount of patriotic rhetoric could soften. Since November 10th, 1775, when saloon-keeper Robert Mullen recruited some cynical historians claim, "Shanghaied" is the more accurate word, the first company of Marines at his Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, the men of the Corps have marched to the nation's wars as first-to-fight shock troops. Of the 140 Marines who served with Captain John Paul Jones on his tiny ship, Bonhomme Richard, in their first battle with the British during the Revolutionary War, 67 were killed or wounded in the engagement. But in 3 hours of deadly hand-to-hand combat, fighting with muskets and cutlasses, they carried the day and captured the Serapis, a much larger and better-armed British man-of-war. At one crucial moment during the struggle, when defeat seemed imminent, the British commander called upon Jones and his Marines to surrender and save further bloodshed. Jones's immortal response, "I have not yet begun to fight," became a gallant battle cry of the yet-to-be-born United States of America. That day, the fighting leatherneck tradition was born in fire and blood, establishing a legacy that would endure through centuries of conflict. Since then, in big wars and minor skirmishes in all parts of the world, from, as the Marine Corps hymn proudly proclaims, the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, theirs has been a heritage born of rigorous training, iron discipline, and esprit de corps that has set them apart from all other armed forces. 2 boot camps, officially designated Marine Corps recruit depots, served as the high-pressure cauldrons from which emerged every enlisted leatherneck and many officers who fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in their sneak attack, the entire Marine Corps, 70,425 officers and enlisted men, could have fitted into the Rose Bowl with 30,000 seats to spare. By VJ Day, when victory was finally achieved, nearly 500,000 men had passed through one or the other of the recruit depots' remote Paris Island in the pine country of South Carolina, or San Diego's base built on a sand spit reclaimed from the Pacific Ocean, just 5 minutes from the center of the bustling city, with a permanent population of 334,387. Both installations enjoyed year-round moderate temperatures, but they were worlds apart in physical appearance and natural surroundings. San Diego's boot camp was typically Southern Californian, a complex of airy, 2-story hacienda-style brick and stucco barracks, connected by arched walkways fronting on a half-mile-long, quarter-mile-wide paved drill ground that blistered with heat during the day. As the war in the Pacific gained momentum and sweep, hundreds of pyramidal tents and dozens of Quonset huts crowded the sandy soil beyond the drill grounds, as thousands of boots arrived in a never-ending flood to be transformed into Marines. The architectural centerpiece of the installation was a magnificent 3,000-seat, air-conditioned theater painted in camouflage stripes of dull green and brown. The theater's next-door neighbors were the San Diego Municipal Airport, known as Lindbergh Field, and the Ryan Aircraft Plant where Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis had been designed and built. The theater was strictly off-limits to recruits, except to watch training films about how to avoid venereal disease, detect Japanese booby traps, or understand why the war was being fought. This gamut of productions was designed to inspire or inform young Americans about what they would face in the war against Japan. Weary recruits struggled to stay awake in the cool, peaceful surroundings of the pleasantly dark movie palace that offered blessed relief from the harsh realities of training. Once a week after the fledgling troops were well into the dawn-to-dark 10-week training schedule, if their drill instructor thought the platoon had performed exceedingly well and he wanted to be a nice guy for a change, boots were marched in formation to see a Hollywood feature and the latest newsreels, along with more training films. 3 times a week, in Southern California's nightly chill that came as a shock to many recruits, they learned water survival techniques, how to swim below the surface with full packs, and to complete at least 2 lengths of the Olympic-sized pool while fully clothed. Those who could not make these requirements did not receive leave at the end of recruit training. Parris Island also had its permanent barracks, Southern-style brick buildings dating back to World War I, mingling with others of the same design constructed since Pearl Harbor. As at San Diego, these were augmented by Quonset huts and tents to handle the booming influx of thousands of Marines in the making. The sprawling base covered 7,819 acres of towering moss-draped oak trees and stubby palmettos infested with thousands of long diamondback rattlesnakes. It was surrounded by smelly and treacherous marshes, bottomless quicksand pits, and putrid streams swarming with alligators, a frightening moat around the dismal and primeval island that was connected to the mainland by a single narrow causeway. On its drill ground, the stomp and cadence of troops marching in close order, along with the shouted commands of drill instructors, sounded through the humid air from daybreak to dusk, and often far into the night. Parris Island also had its theatre, but most training films were shown at night outdoors under the stars. It also featured a huge swimming tank used mainly for the same purpose as San Diego's pool. Both camps had monster combat courses where men learned to climb ropes, cross gullies on rope bridges, vault over trenches and other obstacles, and to develop physical stamina in 100 different ways. Boots spent 2 intensive weeks on the rifle range, mastering M1 Garand rifles and carbines, firing Colt .45 pistols and high-powered BARs, World War I vintage Browning automatic rifles. They picked up a working acquaintance with Thompson submachine guns, learned to use deadly hand grenades, and spent time in a sealed chamber where tear gas introduced them to the terrors of chemical warfare. While the bases were separated by a continent, the harsh discipline and strenuous physical ordeal of training were carbon copies designed to mold radical new mental attitudes, to build bodily endurance and test it to the breaking point, to teach and sharpen deadly skills needed to kill the enemy and survive. Everything had a methodical purpose, rooted in decades of military experience. It was by deliberate design that sleepy and confused boots received their first taste of recruit life in post-midnight darkness, following cross-country trips in converted boxcars with wooden bunks, or ancient Pullmans resurrected from railroad junkyards to carry troops. Recruits from west of the Mississippi River went to San Diego, while Parris Island received those from east of the dividing line. Regardless of when they arrived, even if it was an hour before daybreak, their first day in boot camp began at dawn without exception. The first morning, few ate breakfast from steel trays in crowded mess halls, overwhelmed by the shock of their new environment, but by noon the befuddled newcomers were ravenously hungry. First order of business was a final medical examination to ensure they were fit for the rigors ahead. Then the recruits drew from the quartermaster a canvas sea bag where they would stow their gear throughout boot camp, and in which they would carry personal belongings whenever they travelled aboard ship and headed for combat. It was stuffed with 2 sets of dungarees, a dress uniform, socks, and underwear. A galvanized scrub bucket, 2 bars of ivory soap, and a heavy-duty brush were handed out for daily laundry chores that would become routine. These items too went into the sea bag along with all other issued equipment. The men were issued a rifle that would become their constant companion, 2 knapsacks, 2 canteens, a first aid kit, a web cartridge belt, and 2 pairs of shoes, one for dress occasions, and the other, boondockers with leather reversed and smooth surface inside, for regular wear. Then they were assigned to training platoons and marched, usually for the first time in their lives, in ragged formations to the barber shop, where heads were clipped to the skull by civilian barbers. Boots paid 25 cents in chits for this service, as they were not allowed to have cash during training, emerging looking like frightened and shorn sheep. Thus began 70 days, 18 hours a day, of near-constant bedlam, of unremitting prodding and harassment, of muscle-building physical conditioning, of training under live ammunition, of methodically becoming integral cogs in the Marine Corps' fighting machine. It was a pivotal time for young men, many of whom had never been away from home before leaving for boot camp, and they would never forget the experience. Reveille sounded in the cold pre-dawn darkness, and woe unto the man who had not shaved, relieved himself, made up his bunk, and dressed in the prescribed uniform of the day within 10 minutes of that wake-up call. Then came a fast-paced run to a mess hall, where exactly 20 minutes were allotted for breakfast. Everything operated on a demanding schedule that brooked no delays. After chow, 10 minutes were given to square away tents and barracks for inspection and to muster for roll call, followed by 45 minutes of rigorous calisthenics designed to build strength and endurance. Then came 4 hours of close-order drill, always strenuous but particularly painful during the first days before medical inoculations had lost their sting and soreness. Following this came a fast-mile run to the mess hall for the noon meal, maintaining the relentless pace. If the men had performed to the harsh demands of hard-nosed drill instructors, they were granted a 30-minute break for rest and relaxation. Otherwise, it was double time back to the drill ground for a penalty session of non-stop close-order marching that served as both punishment and additional conditioning. The afternoon routine brought no let-up in intensity. It was crammed with bayonet drill, judo, and hand-to-hand combat training. The more strenuous and savage, the better in the minds of the instructors. Each platoon had 3 drill instructors, usually a sergeant and 2 corporals, who barked, yelled, and cursed at the sweating, tired, often frightened out of their wits recruits. These instructors threatened dire consequences if the trainees did not attack each other with greater violence during combat training. Then came trade school, as troops learned to strip down their rifles and reassemble them until they could perform the task blindfolded in complete darkness. They crawled under barbed wire with machine gun fire cracking inches above their heads, a terrifying but essential training exercise. They learned the basics about bazookas, flamethrowers, demolitions charges, and enemy booby traps that could kill the unwary. Things quieted down somewhat toward evening, when the trainees attended lectures about military courtesy, tactics in combat, and the history and traditions of the Marine Corps, a comprehensive litany of what was not only expected but demanded of every man who finished boot camp successfully. Before supper, there was time for a quick shower, policing the platoon's area, and again the march to the mess hall for the evening meal. There was still much to accomplish before lights out at 10 o'clock, rifles to be cleaned to spotless condition, clothes to be washed by hand, writing short letters home to worried families, and studying the guidebook. The guidebook was a thick manual with a blood-red cover that contained pertinent official regulations, including 11 always enforced general orders governing conduct and chain of command, highlights of Marine Corps history, and the heroic deeds of its legendary heroes and martyrs. The guidebook served as the Bible of Marine Corps life as far as boots were concerned, containing everything they needed to know about their new existence. Like shaving cream and soap, it was purchased by chit from the post exchange, as recruits were not allowed to handle cash. But recruits were strictly forbidden to buy candy called pogey bait for some unknown reason or gum. Sweets might be acceptable for sailors and soldiers, drill instructors made it crystal clear, but not for someone who aspired to become a Marine. Sleep came quickly to the exhausted men each night, but not before most wondered if life in the Marine Corps would always be this demanding and difficult. Or could it, possibly get worse than what they were already experiencing? Rare was the boot who did not flirt with the idea of going over the hill and running away from the whole overwhelming experience. Very few actually tried to escape, however. Paris Island's formidable natural moat and San Diego's 12-foot brick wall topped with chain-link fence saw to that. Regardless of season, and contrary to the optimistic claims of Chamber of Commerce boosters in San Diego, boots found the climate miserable most of the time at both camps. Nights could be bone-chilling during winter months, and daytime temperatures could soar to readings exceeding 100 degrees. Days of heavy rain meant virtually nothing to the rigid training schedule that continued without pause. 20-mile hikes with full combat gear were routine exercises in blazing sun and in driving nighttime downpours that tested endurance to the limits. Post-midnight bug-out evacuation drills were commonplace as shouting drill instructors stormed among the bunks and roused the men, exhausted, undressed and shivering, into the cold darkness for emergency exercises. Sometimes it was punishment for a mistake by the platoon. Sometimes it was merely a demonstration of power, of absolute authority, that drill instructors wielded over their charges. "Just think what could happen to you idiots if I really wanted to get tough," recruits were told, as they stood in formation and shook with a combination of fear and cold that penetrated to their bones. Hardly a day passed that some boot was not ordered to smoke an entire pack of cigarettes, whether he was a smoker or not, while standing at rigid attention with a bucket of sand balanced on his head. It was standard punishment for not reacting to an order in a split second, or for daring to talk back to a drill instructor who demanded instant obedience. The routine penalty for having a dirty rifle and dirt meant even a few smudges of dust in the barrel was for a recruit to sleep, or attempt to sleep, with the weapon under his back or buttocks in the narrow bunk. The discomfort was intentional and served as a constant reminder of the importance of weapon maintenance. Thus did these young men gradually become Marines and learn the stern, unforgiving code of the Corps. They learned it in an atmosphere of constant apprehension and fear, of constant challenge to physical capabilities and mental resilience that pushed them beyond what they thought possible. It was not uncommon for a boot to be physically beaten by an especially hard-nosed drill instructor who believed that pain was an effective teacher, and both San Diego and Paris Island recorded several tragic cases of suicide by recruits who could not comprehend or endure the mind-boggling physical and mental pressures of transformation. It was perfectly acceptable for boots to complain bitterly to each other about the horrible treatment and miserable conditions they endured daily, but carrying complaints further, either in formal complaints to officers or in letters home to worried families, verged on treason in the eyes of their fellow recruits. Those who did complain formally, and were discovered by their peers, were ostracized by comrades going through the same brutal ordeal. "Crybaby, if you cannot take the treatment, why did you join the Marines?" was the blunt reaction from fellow recruits who had no sympathy for weakness. More often than not, the recalcitrant individual would shape up and successfully complete training after learning to adapt. A few were mustered out as unfit for Marine Corps duty, returning to civilian life with their tails between their legs. Once a recruit passed through the front gates of boot camp, he remained there until he graduated with honor or was discharged as unfit for service. If he was granted an emergency furlough, it was a rare occurrence, usually involving serious illness or death in the immediate family. Overnight or weekend liberty passes were absolutely unheard of, and recreation was strictly limited and doled out to platoons when drill instructors felt so inclined, which was seldom indeed. Some platoons organized boxing matches, but these were roughhouse melees with many fighters purposely mismatched to test the mettle and courage of the underdog. Newspapers were seldom seen by recruits, and when available were usually outdated editions that provided little current information. The only radio in the platoon's area was located in the drill instructor's Quonset duty hut, and it was for their ears only. Sunday brought a welcome break in the grueling routine, but it was hardly a holiday of rest and relaxation. Reveille sounded late at 6 o'clock instead of the usual 5 in the morning, but the firehouse stampede to shave, shower, dress properly and fall out for inspection was missing. On Sundays, the men had a full hour to accomplish these tasks and marched to a special steak and eggs breakfast. Church call came at 9 o'clock, and base chapels usually overflowed with recruits, as much to escape the platoon area as for genuine religious reasons. The rest of the day, after the noon meal, was spent washing clothes by hand, cleaning rifles to perfection, writing letters home to families and girlfriends, shining dress shoes that would not be worn until graduation day. Sunday activities also included studying general orders and Marine Corps regulations in the guidebook, discussing the hectic happenings of the week with fellow recruits, talking about civilian life that seemed increasingly distant, speculating about the uncertain future, and visiting hometown buddies in other platoons if drill instructors permitted such rare indulgences. Boots were allowed to sit on their bunks during these free periods, but cat naps crapping out in Marine parlance were strictly forbidden at all times. A card game, with matches serving as chips, might be in progress with players coming and going, but only if the drill instructors thought learning to gamble was part of the process of making good Marines. Most did indeed believe this, but they made it crystal clear they did not want to catch men with actual money on the table during these games. By this time, the men had drawn their first Marine Corps pay and drill instructors offered a knowing wink when they declared that any form of gambling for cash was strictly against regulations. For some fortunate recruits, Sunday brought a precious touch of home and civilian life that helped sustain their spirits. Recruits could receive visitors for exactly 2 hours in the afternoon, and the special visiting area was jammed with family members and friends, many of whom had brought elaborate picnic baskets filled with home cooking. Many visitors had traveled hundreds of miles to be with their Marines and boost their sagging spirits during this difficult transformation period. These visits provided crucial emotional support that helped many recruits endure the rigors of training. The training regimen was designed with scientific precision to break down civilian habits and rebuild men according to Marine Corps standards. Every aspect of daily life was regulated and controlled, from the moment of awakening until lights out at night. Physical conditioning was relentless and progressive, building strength and endurance week by week. Mental conditioning was equally important, instilling discipline, obedience, and the warrior mentality that would be essential in combat against a fanatical enemy. The drill instructors, despite their harsh methods, were generally combat veterans who understood what their charges would face in the Pacific theater. Their brutality served a purpose: to prepare these young men for the ultimate brutality of warfare against an enemy who showed no mercy. Weapons training was intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from the basic rifle to specialized equipment like flamethrowers and demolitions. Marksmanship standards were exceptionally high, and those who failed to qualify faced additional training until they met requirements. Combat training included realistic exercises with live ammunition, simulated battlefield conditions, and scenarios based on actual combat experiences in the Pacific. Night training was particularly emphasized, as much fighting in the Pacific occurred under cover of darkness. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most important aspect of boot camp. Young men arrived as individuals with civilian mentalities and departed as Marines with an unshakable esprit de corps and dedication to the Corps and their fellow Marines. Leadership training began early, with some recruits identified as potential squad leaders and given additional responsibilities. The Marine Corps believed in developing leaders at every level, recognizing that combat casualties would create constant demands for new leadership. Medical training was basic but essential, teaching every Marine fundamental first aid skills that could save lives in combat. This training often proved as valuable as weapons skills when Marines found themselves isolated from medical personnel. The final weeks of training included comprehensive field exercises that tested everything the recruits had learned. These exercises were designed to simulate actual combat conditions as closely as possible without using live enemy fire. Graduation day was a moment of tremendous pride for those who successfully completed the transformation from civilian to Marine. The ceremony was formal and dignified, recognizing the achievement of joining one of America's most elite fighting forces. For those who graduated, boot camp had accomplished its fundamental purpose, transforming ordinary American youth into extraordinary Marines, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the Pacific War. They carried with them not just military skills, but an unbreakable bond with their fellow Marines and an unwavering commitment to the Corps' motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The lessons learned in boot camp would serve these Marines well in the battles to come, from the beaches of Iwo Jima to the hills of Okinawa and beyond. The brutal training they had endured, the discipline they had internalized, and the esprit de corps they had developed would prove invaluable when facing the ultimate test of combat. Many would look back on boot camp as the most difficult yet most important period of their lives, the crucible that forged them into Marines and prepared them for the ultimate sacrifice that military service might require. The memories of those 70 days would remain with them forever, a source of pride and strength in the darkest moments of war. The transformation was complete. Boys had become Marines, ready to uphold the proud traditions of the Corps and add their own chapter to its glorious history. They had earned the right to be called Marines, and with that title came both great honor and terrible responsibility. As they departed for advanced training and eventual deployment to the Pacific theater, these newly minted Marines carried with them the knowledge, skills, and spirit that would enable them to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were ready to join their brothers in arms in the ongoing struggle against tyranny and oppression. The Marine Corps had done its job well. These young Americans were no longer the confused, frightened recruits who had arrived at boot camp weeks earlier. They were now Marines, ready to serve their country with honor, courage, and commitment, whatever the cost might be.